Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in Heian, Japan, with the Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu. Think of this book not as an epic of romance, but as an anatomy of a machine that turns beauty into authority and grief into leverage. And then ask how such a machine keeps itself running when its heart is mostly ceremonial. Murasaki's pages show an emperor whose power looks like a sun behind ritual screens, visible in light and posture, essential to the system's legitimacy, yet unable to touch the levers that really move men. The Kiritsubo scenes, the emperor who keeps a favorite by his side through business and mourning audiences, who weeps and will not close his eyes, make that awkward truth literal. His ardor is public, his authority compromised, and the court murmurs, comparing him to Yang Kui-fei while his barons look askance. That gap between sacred center and practical force is the book's first diagnosis and the story's economy of risk. The emperor's position at the apex of the court is both absolute and hollow. Absolute because no one challenges his formal authority directly. Hollow because the real work of governance passes through other hands entirely. He is the sun whose light warms the palace gardens, but the gardens are tended by the Fujiwara. Because the center is ceremonial, the actual instruments of rule congregate in another place, the family. The Fujiwara logic, the regent who governs by marriage, who gives legitimacy through daughters rather than by sword, sits quietly in the background of every intimate episode. In Genji, the emperor reigns. The families manage the reign. You see it in the way courtiers count offspring as feats of policy, in the staggered panic when a new child arrives, in the way a minister of the right or left can move lineages into tighter knots. The emperor may ponder passing over an heir for the boy he loves, but his inability to mount that choice without a faction's backing reveals how vital kinship access has become. Marriages are not private affections, but instruments that reorder political geometry. This is the court's arithmetic. A daughter placed in the right wing of the palace at the right moment is worth more than a regiment. She is the instrument by which a family converts beauty into succession, and succession into permanent command of the administrative machinery. The Fujiwara did not rise by force. They rose by daughters and poems. If power has moved from arms to bloodlines and chamber doors, ritual becomes a language that replaces command. The initiation of Genji, the putting on of the trousers, the purple fillet, the gift torrents from the imperial treasury, these are not mere ceremony but the court's currency. Rank determines which door opens to you, which veil is lifted, whom you may address and when. The Daijō-kan can send decrees, but the real passage of advantage runs through tokens and timetables. When the emperor delays affairs because songs and nocturnes pull at his mind, when the chambermaids whisper and the carvers groan at neglected bowls, we are watching governance turned into exquisitely choreographed negligence. The visible order conceals a different logistics. Influence moves along intimacy and invitation rather than through ministries and rosters. The formal bureaucratic structure, the 9 ranks, the offices, the departments of state exists and is observed, but it operates largely as the public face of decisions made elsewhere, in rooms that have no official designation, between people whose relationship has no administrative title. That choreography wants a stage, and the court builds one in wood and paper. Heian architecture enforces politics. The shinden plan, the veranda, the blind, and the screen. Women live behind paper that is social as much as practical, and the book forces us to feel how space disciplines life. Genji slides across those screens and rooms, peeping through a crack, listening at a sliding window, occupying the small corner behind a lattice. And every furtive motion tells us how visibility gets parceled out. Men move through courtyards, ride in carriages, enter public halls. Women practice presence in the inner room. The court's geography is a map of access. That asymmetry makes waiting itself into an art and a condition. The world of those who must receive is ruled by hours, appointments, and the patience of being seen. This architectural asymmetry is not simply custom. It is the physical expression of a political logic. The screen that divides Genji from the women he courts is the same screen that divides the formally powerful from those who exercise influence through a different register. Everyone in the palace is behind some screen. The question is which direction one peers from and what one is permitted to see. Out of that enforced waiting emerges a politics of perception. The book constantly reminds us that reputation and feeling are convertible into power. A poem is a token. A hand-lettered line functions as a brief of influence. Fortune tellers nod at princes. Scribes copy verses with the same gravity as legal diplomas, and the smallest fan with a line of verse can tilt favor. Genji's charm is, among other things, poetic capital. A fortune teller in secret calls him father of the state. The fan and the poem carry courtly signals, and the messenger with a single verse is as dangerous as an emissary with a scroll. The consequence is paradoxical. Sensitivity becomes competence. Elegance, taste, the ability to make a line land at dusk, all these are political craft. That cultivation rewards performance and punishes lapse, so that being wrong at the wrong hour, wearing the wrong color, sending the wrong metaphor, can cost you patronage and place. The court does not merely value aesthetics alongside other skills. It makes aesthetics the primary register of all skills. There is no domain of political judgment that is not also a domain of aesthetic judgment, which means that the courtier who cannot compose is as politically disabled as a general who cannot read a map. This system rewards delicacy while starving for substance. The court depends on provincial grain, on estates whose income slips through fingers it cannot see. The tale drops us into those seams. Governors like Iyo no Suke, lay priests turned provincial lords who build vast seaside houses and amuse themselves with recluses on the shore. Small tenements where the evening flowers cluster and a prince, disguised, can meet a stranger. The court consumes the province's yield, and the shōen estates grow as private havens carved out of the central tax base. So you get the paradox that brilliant ceremonial theater and exquisite festivals are financed by a tax system that is quietly fragmenting beneath the splendor. The result is a culture whose wealth of form grows as its material cohesion thins. The Heian aristocracy does not notice its fiscal erosion because the evidence arrives in the provinces, which the aristocracy regards as embarrassing and essentially foreign. The men who govern those provinces are, in the court's estimation, lesser beings. Their work is not the real work of civilization. And so the real work of civilizational survival is delegated to people the court refuses to take seriously. And material inequality shows up in the human choreography. Rank is nearly immobile, and yet marriage creates a single loophole: daughters. A family's daughters are its ambassadors and its camp signals. A clan that marries widely rules without open battle. The Korodans spite against a woman not of very high rank yet beloved, the jealous tricks hurled at the Kiritsubo lady, the way Cohesion and her court bully and conspire. All this is marriage's statecraft in action. The mother's house rules the child. The father manages protocol. Children grow up in their mother's nets. Genji himself is a study in liminality. Imperial in blood, yet made a Minamoto, set outside succession. His removal from the line supplies him both mobility and peril. He can move through courts. He courts ladies. He cultivates protégés, Murasaki, the lady of Akashi. And yet the very openness that gives him social latitude also makes him politically combustible. His position is the court's most elegant solution to the problem of exceptional talent. Give the brilliant man a prestigious surname and a half-step outside the succession, close enough to be useful, far enough to be manageable. It is a formula that acknowledges his value by denying its full implications. That combustibility shows whenever intimacy collides with faction. The emperor's tenderness for a woman of lower rank turns scandalous talk into state anxiety. Whispers of Kui-fei spread because emotional display can be read as administrative dereliction. When a beloved dies and the ruler withdraws into grief, the court sees not private sorrow, but a threat to public order. Mourning is not just grief in Genji's world. It is a political variable. The 7 weeks of minutely observed mourning, the pyres and proclamations, the funeral poems, ritual becomes the means by which the polity recalibrates moral credit and public exposure. And the book keeps nudging us to notice that these acts of commemoration are as much about reassigning reputational capital as they are about honoring the dead. To grieve too much is to confess that private feeling has overtaken public duty. To grieve too little is to confess indifference to beauty, which is the court's primary form of virtue. The mourning period is therefore not a time of suspension from the political. It is an intensely political interval in which how you mourn communicates your understanding of the proper relationship between private feeling and public role. It is in those acts of commemoration and in the seasonal talk that the culture's sense of impermanence quietly organizes everything. Poetic images, dew on blades of grass, the autumn moon that seems to sink though you cannot tell where it goes, the cicada's empty husk, are not mere ornaments. They are the court's way of turning ephemerality into skill. When the emperor says that real things in the darkness seem no realer than dreams, he does not utter a lament. He recasts loss as an aesthetic competence. Performance teaches actors to bear the transient. So the aesthetic life becomes the practical technology of a society that must make continuity out of loss. That converts mourning into ritual and ritual into authority. These are not metaphors only. They are the operating instructions of a regime whose formal ceremonies keep time where force no longer dictates. The Japanese aristocracy of the Heian period understood, in ways it probably could not have articulated directly, that its hold on authority was essentially cultural. It could not compel, but it could persuade. It could not enforce, but it could define what counted as civilization. And yet there is always the recoil. Ritual can discipline, but it cannot manufacture resources. As the court perfects its ceremonies, shōen estates eat away at the fiscal base and provincial governors gain independence in wealth and will. The tale offers episodes that make this tension visible. The ex-governor of Harima who lives in sumptuous seaside retirement, the Akashi mansion whose scale betrays a different economy, Koremitsu and steward sons who shuttle between houses and tell different truths. The court's beauty is a financed performance whose invoices are increasingly paid elsewhere. That structural contradiction sows the seeds of a politics where commanders with actual forces will later find purchase in a world the court thinks it owns. This is the deep irony of the tale's setting. The most refined moment of Japanese aristocratic culture is simultaneously the moment when the institutions sustaining that culture have begun their long retreat. The elegance is real. The vulnerability is also real. They are the same thing. The architectural privacy that confines women also converts them into instruments of alliance. The act of placing a daughter in the palace is the act of staking a claim. The careful raising of a young woman in refined arts, calligraphy, poetry, music, is training her to be both beauty and bond. Murasaki's education, taught into being by Genji's intent, is at once a private consolation and an investment in social currency. Yet the book never lets us forget the cruelty baked into that strategy. Cultivation does not equal security. Yugo is taught charm and refinement, then discarded and dies. Even the highest refinements cannot immunize the body or the household against the casual violence of gossip and faction. The court civilities do not dissolve the raw contingency of lives. The daughter prepared for court may enter its bright rooms and find herself no more protected than her mother was in her provincial house. Rank is a form of exposure as much as a form of shelter, and the more visible the woman, the more precisely targeted she becomes. Because visibility is so tightly rationed, envy turns corrosive quickly. The tales of jealous tricks, locked porticos, ruined robes, hateful gifts, make malice mundane. A poem sent at an unlucky hour can be a career killer, because it reveals willingness where the clan demands calculation. The waiting system, where women live by the clock of visits, where messages pass by pages, where a servant's folded paper can set whole households trembling, produces a delicate economy of suspense. Waiting is not passivity, it is labor, and in the book, waiting becomes a gendered technology of dependence. The father visits like a dignified absence. The mother runs the household as a logistical sovereign. The children are folded into maternal precincts, and the man who remains mobile risks being read as dangerous because his movement rewrites alliances. The man who cannot commit to a single household keeps all households in a state of anxious uncertainty, and that uncertainty, that endless not knowing when the next visit will come, what it will mean, what its cessation will signal, is the atmosphere in which the women of Genji's world spend their lives. Beyond choreography and scandal, the tale insists that a court closed to production will be corrosive of the trust that sustains it. The invisible labor of commoners, the gardeners, the laundresses, the steward with his rush mat at the dead nun's house, are absent from the pages as characters with arcs, yet they are everywhere as the substrate upon which the court's life depends. The swift and practical work Koremitsu does, carrying bodies, arranging funerals, fitting poor apartments into a prince's whim, reveals how much of aristocratic refinement is held up by hands no one honors in public. When Genji travels, when he slips into a shabby quarter to pluck evening faces, he meets, briefly, the economy that funds his silk and his incense. Those encounters unsettle his cultivated identity. They expose how thin the bubble of court insulation really is. The shabbiness of the streets outside the palace is not the absence of the court's civilization. It is the precondition of it, the material base on which the elaborate superstructure rests, and Genji's brief contact with it leaves him not curious, but vaguely disturbed. The book also stages a moral dilemma of governance. If authority is exercised by access and aesthetics, who enforces consequence? You see this in the emperor's temptation to promote his favorite son, and then pulling back because he lacks factional support. You see it in courtiers whispering comparisons to other scandalized rulers. Power has become taste plus alliance, but alliances are brittle. The court's elaborate theater can postpone questions of extraction and enforcement, but it cannot prevent them from returning with practical weight. And Murasaki's scenes show the long slippage between dignified display and administrative neglect. The court cannot answer the question of consequence because its tools are all aesthetic. It can compose an elegy about failure, but it cannot prevent the failure that the elegy describes. That slippage prepares a later shift of power that Genji's world suggests without narrating. When ceremony becomes an end in itself and revenues decentralize into shōen, the people who can mobilize men and resources beyond the palace walls will find themselves in a position to claim authority that ritual meant to sustain. The tale's politics contains the patterns of decline precisely because it makes visible the brittle mechanisms of elite dominance. Marriage saturation by one family, ritual brilliance masking fiscal erosion, the privatization of power into household networks. The story spends its pages not predicting collapse, so much as setting out the fault lines with an intimate care that makes the collapse feel inevitable. Every scene of exquisite ceremonial is simultaneously a scene of political hollowing out. The more elaborate the ritual, the more one suspects that it is compensating for something that has gone missing from the political body proper. None of this, though, is merely clinical. The book keeps returning to the human inside the mechanism. A prince who learns to love poems and textiles as modes of power. A woman who dies of the cruelty of being too visible and not visible enough. A child uprooted and folded into an uncle's palace because of the delicate business of kinship. Those episodes are not illustrations. They work like thought experiments. When the emperor sends for morning and evening a picture and keeps the dead lady's gifts as mementos, he was rehearsing the way memory can be converted into obligation. When the nun refuses Genji's offer for her grandchild because the child is a mere infant, she is, in a different register, defending a household against the commodification of relationships. Each domestic choice carries political effect. Each intimate failure feeds a public problem. So the tale's social world is an economy in which impermanence is the raw material. Seasons fall, lovers die, children are adopted, offices rotate, estates become more private. The court dresses its fragility in gorgeous ceremonies, and in doing so it both dignifies loss and postpones the reckoning. You see how grief is transformed into ritual practice. 7 weeks of mourning, elaborate funerals, the careful composition of prayers and poems, and how those practices redistribute attention and privilege. Nothing here resolves the fragility. It only makes it legible and at times productive. The emperor's sorrow, a lover's obsession, a mother's despair. Each becomes a lever in the social machine, but no lever finally repairs the structural contradictions. What the court offers is not solutions, but processes. Ways of moving through damage that preserve the form of order even as they accumulate its costs. Murasaki leaves us with no tidy conclusion, because the book's energy is analytic rather than teleological. It refuses to be a morality play about good rulers and bad factions. It insists instead on showing the landscape of effects that follow from a court that learns to govern through beauty, through kinship, and through the exacting grammar of ceremony. Those visible practices, poems sent, screens raised, gifts returned, funerals celebrated, are the ways a polity without central extraction rewrites authority into everyday life. The consequence is not collapse in a single instant, but a slow drift. The center grows more symbolic, while power finds new hands elsewhere. And every act of politeness adds one more stitch to a garment that hides the frayed seams beneath. And because the tale refuses tidy endings, it keeps asking us to watch patterns rather than wait for verdicts. The episodes it gives us: an emperor who cannot shut his eyes, a lord who must be disavowed and yet cannot be forgotten, a little girl taught to write and then carried into a new household, are not evidence for a moral lesson, but for a recurring logic. Marriage converts into strategy, poetry becomes capital, waiting becomes labor, ritual masks material weakness. The book's last service is to let you see how those logics inflect every human interaction, so that, even when beauty dominates, the cost of sustaining beauty remains stubbornly real and infinitely precarious. This is a book that was written by a woman inside the system it describes, using the tools of that system to expose what those tools are for. And in doing so, it achieves something that the court's official records could never accomplish. It shows us not what the Heian state decided, but what it cost, and who paid. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe. One new book every week. At least we try.